Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, is one of America's most prolific serial killers. There are 49 confirmed killings, but it is expected he killed as many as 75 to 80 women, and he got away with it for 20 years, where he lived in and around the areas of Tacoma and Seattle, Washington. I am going to briefly tell you about his background, but my main focus of this video series is to concentrate on the husband, the wife, and the serial killer, and the outcome of their stories. I will also include as much as I can about his victims. However, some of these serial killers have killed so many, like Ridgway, to include and recognize them individually will be impossible to do for this particular series. With that being said, Ridgway was married 3 times when, after his second divorce in 1981, he became the killer that lived within him that finally sprung to life by the year 1982 and lasted until his capture in 2001. By 1982, he started his killing spree, where he picked up young, vulnerable women who were mostly prostitutes and runaways and became his prey of choice. He hunted them along the roadways of Highway 99, also known as the SeaTac Strip south of Seattle, and along the South Pacific Highway in Seattle, Washington, locations where sex workers were known to hang out. His pattern of killing his victims was sex-related, which turned into assault and strangulation. Then he would dump their bodies in remote locations like rivers, creeks, and wooded areas. Gary was born in Utah in 1949, but was raised in Washington State, near Seattle's SeaTac Airport. As a child, he had trouble doing well in school, to which his mother belittled him. He also had a very low IQ, around 82. Gary had a bedwetting problem, to which his mother would humiliate him for by stripping him down and cleaning him off, even at an older age that he could have cleaned himself. But while she would do this, she would wear provocative clothing in which he began to have sexual fantasies about his own mother. And at the same time, this also angered him, and he ended up developing hatred for his mother. According to FBI behavioral profilers concerning serial killers, bedwetting past the age of 5 that becomes a continuous problem, along with harming animals, are patterns linked to precursors of someone becoming a serial killer, and neighborhood kids did witness Gary torturing animals. Gary also didn't graduate high school until he was 20 in 1969. The first real flag that showed up was when he was 14 years old. He lured a 6-year-old boy off and stabbed the boy several times, to which the boy asked him why he did it. Gary's reply was because he wanted to know how it felt to kill someone. Then he walked away and left the boy for dead. Fortunately, the little boy survived the incident and was able to tell his story, but it was clear that Gary intended to kill him. In 1970, he married his high school girlfriend, Claudia Craig, and after their marriage, he enlisted in the Navy, where he was stationed in the Philippines during the Vietnam War. It was in the Philippines he gained a lust for sex workers, where he frequently caught sexually transmitted diseases, which began to anger him even though he continued being with these sex workers regardless. His wife back home began to suspect his unfaithful proclivities overseas. She even began an affair herself. Then she divorced him in 1972. In 1973, he met and married his second wife, Marcia Lorene, in which a child resulted in 1975, a son named Matthew. By 1981, Marcia divorced Gary because he had become physically abusive, often putting her into chokeholds and demanding constant sex. Up until this point, Gary had never killed any prostitutes or any women until after his divorce, in which he later basically admits the anger towards his second wife could be what steered him into his hatred for prostitutes. Apparently, before their marriage ended, he believed Marcia was unfaithful as well, but in reality, she was probably growing scared of him because of the abuse she was enduring. Gary was a sexual deviant and addict. It is widely believed after the 2 failed marriages, and especially the second divorce, that pushed him over the edge. He chose vulnerable, easy prey because sex workers willingly went with him. Even between the years of 1982 and 1984, the years he killed the most of his victims, and when it was widely known in the Seattle area that there was a dangerous serial killer, maniac, and rapist on the loose, when in 1983, the Green River Task Force of King County Sheriff's Office was formed as the result of the importance to catch him. including a highly publicized response of a very scared and concerned community, often demonstrated public that would march through the streets demanding more to be done to find the killer. Some people believed, because the victims were prostitutes, that the police were dragging their feet, as if these women had no value to their lives. But this was the 80s, before DNA was around, and serial killers at the time were thought to be loners. In the beginning, they were just looking in all the wrong places because it wasn't something that was known for serial killers to live double lives, have families and regular jobs, and live amongst the community and blend in like a chameleon, and that's exactly what he was doing. Even some of the more apprehensive sex workers began asking for identification from their clients, but he would quickly throw them off by showing a photo of his son that he kept in his wallet to ease their fears and gain his trust. Perhaps in their mind, any man who was a divorced father who carried a photo of his son in his wallet couldn't possibly be the elusive killer that was murdering prostitutes, only later to find out they would unfortunately make his growing list. Between the years of 1982 to 1984, with his first 5 victims being found in the Green River and how he would earn the nickname the Green River Killer, he had developed a pattern for picking up young prostitutes and runaways between the ages of 14 to 30, drive them somewhere for privacy, and after he had sex with them, and I quote from his later confessions after his arrest, "My urge to kill was greater than my urge to have sex." He would then get behind them and strangle them with his arms, and sometimes use a tourniquet made from the victim's clothing. The first 5 victims that were killed within the same month were all killed in the same manner and dumped into the Green River. He then began to murder women in other areas. He never changed his MO, his style of killing, only the locations, a tactic he used to throw the police off. He even admitted later that he killed most of them at his own home, inside of his bedroom, and a house he bought in a heavily populated neighborhood after his second divorce, but no one suspected a thing. He would then remove them and discard them in various remote locations, like in the woods, a creek, or a river, some of them found near the airport, within just a few miles of where he lived. He used tactics like leaving cigarette butts, even though he never smoked, chewing gum, and other various trash items around the body to confuse the police. He often used the woods near the airport to kill victims because the many airplanes taking off or landing on a regular basis would obstruct the hearing of anyone else who might be around, so they would never hear the screams of his victims. By 1984, in just 2.5 years, Gary had killed around 43 women, with some of the victims still missing. By 1986, the task force was getting desperate for answers. Detective Dave Reichert of the King County Sheriff's Department and investigator Robert Keppel actually was given express permission by Bundy himself to be interviewed, and Keppel would later go on to write a book called The Riverman, a name Ted Bundy had dubbed for Gary when questioned about the Green River Killer. But the rest of the book was titled Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer. But before this, during the interview, Bundy told them that the killer was most likely revisiting the sites to have sex with the corpses, and that they should find a fresh grave, stake it out, and they would catch their man. They didn't follow Bundy's advice about a stakeout, but Bundy was right about Gary being a necrophiliac, and later would confess to revisiting the bodies to have sex with their corpses because by then they couldn't feel anything and no one would hear any screams. Sometimes it takes a serial killer to catch a serial killer. There was one victim of Gary's that didn't fit his MO. Someone he claims was never supposed to become a victim, and that initially he could see her as his next girlfriend. He met Carol Christensen in 1983. She was someone he met and tried to date, not as a sex worker, but as a young single mother with a little girl who had to work to be able to support herself. I think she agreed to a date with Gary, and the two dated a few times. But one evening, as she was getting ready for work, he requested sex with her. Although she wasn't really feeling the vibe and wanting to reciprocate, she agreed, but during the act, apparently she told him to hurry up and finish because she didn't want to be late for work. This angered him, and the rejection he felt from her saying, "hurry up," hurt his pride and his ego, so he strangled her, then placed her body in the woods. When her body was discovered 6 days later on Mother's Day, he had fully clothed her and positioned her on her back, hands folded across her chest, holding a sausage, with dead fish and trash found all around her body, including a paper bag over her head. It was never really acknowledged by him as to why he displayed her body in this way, but most likely to humiliate her corpse and to further bewilder the police. It is a wonder he didn't become a suspect then, but because they only dated about 3 times, most likely no one knew them as a couple, so he got away with her murder as well. Gary met Judith Mawson in 1985. She would later change her name to Judith Lynch after he was caught and she divorced him. When Gary met her, he claimed she changed his life. Apparently, the two got along very well, and according to friends, neighbors, and co-workers, the two seemed very much in love, and it appeared that Gary treated Judith very well. The task force had started to notice by the beginning of 1985 the killings began to stop. While they were still finding the remains of missing women whose bodies weren't recovered until years later, but still believed to be victims of their unsub, no new killings were happening anymore. They began to feel that perhaps he had possibly been arrested for something else and was locked away somewhere in prison, or that he could even be dead. However, they had a bit of a break in the case in 1987, 2 years after he was already living with Judith, and Ridgway became a suspect after 2 eyewitnesses claimed they saw and were able to identify him, and I will get to those stories a little bit later. By the time he met Judith, his future third wife, in 1985, he would go on a short hiatus, a period in which he later revealed that basically he found his soulmate in life and lost his desire to kill anymore. It was during this break in the killing action, so to speak, time period, he also became extremely religious and could often be found crying in the back pews after a sermon in church. Not long after Judith met Gary, she moved into the very same home with him, unknowingly, just like his oblivious neighbors. She had settled into a portal of hell, a murder house and dwelling of a very dangerous and wanted serial killer. By now, not only was the state of Washington aware of the Green River Killer, but so was the rest of the country. But it wouldn't take long and Gary couldn't resist his urge to kill anymore, and although he didn't kill as many as he had in the years between 1982 and 1984, he did start to kill again while he was with Judith, even after they were married in 1988 and into the 90s, with more bodies being found, some never identified to this day and some still missing. Their marriage in 1988 took place in a neighbor's yard. This would be a year after the task force would search his home, property, and truck, but came up empty-handed, so they had to let him go and close the investigation on him, to which I will start to get into that later in the story, because this part ends up mattering a great deal, and the means to the end of his reign of terror over a decade later. So he married Judith near his own home in the neighborhood near his home and former killing ground until Judith came along in 1985. Surrounded by family and friends, in which one neighbor recalled in hindsight and would later say how unbelievable it was that she witnessed the marriage of an innocent woman marry a serial killer. I mean, who can say they got to do that before? Hopefully none of us. Even though the King County Sheriff's Department admits today how horrible the special task force they formed early on had to disband in 1987, having known they hadn't caught the Green River Killer in over a decade, and how they failed in that aspect. Well, that's the thing about a double-life serial killer. They live in plain sight as opposed to the ones who are loners, who inhabit dark, creepy spaces to hide out, whose reign of terror usually lasts relatively a short period of time compared to Ridgway, who managed to evade capture for 20 years. He was a part of his community, he was well-liked, and in their eyes, he was one of them. Even when his home was being invaded by the search warrant in 1987, his neighbors and friends were shocked by this. And even Judith gave him the benefit of the doubt, chalking it up to a case of mistaken identity. By 1988, no one the wiser that knew Gary would ever think he was the Green River Killer. He had a wife, friends, a son, a steady job. He attended church, and he had a mortgage to pay. But the authorities at the time didn't push hard enough for an ongoing investigation into who Gary really was at first, which I will get into later. But in the 1987 investigation, something just didn't sit right with one of the detectives, He believed Ridgway was the guy, and this detective was smart enough to take a sample of his saliva before having to close the investigation on him. DNA was not yet perfected enough to take the chance on testing such small samples, so they had to sit on that one for about a decade until advancements in DNA testing had improved. Like I said before, I am going to tell you about the time periods when Gary was pinging on the task force's radar. The problem was, they could never get that smoking gun evidence and the evidence they wanted to secure a conviction. Some of the detectives on the force were unconvinced it was even him, while others were dead set it was him. They just needed to prove it. And here are some of the reasons why. Gary became a suspect on several occasions, but that was all he was until 2001. Back in 1982, he was arrested and booked in jail for solicitation to prostitution. This was 10 months after his first kill. In the same year, another victim and sole survivor of the Green River Killer named Rebecca Garday had escaped him by biting him while he had his pants down around his ankles, making it harder to catch her when she escaped and ran. She ended up picking out his mugshot lined up along 6 other men and identified her attacker, and it was Gary. Then, in 1983, he became a suspect when the boyfriend of 18-year-old Marie Malvar witnessed her get into Gary's truck on Pacific Highway South. The boyfriend ended up following them for as long as he could keep up, but ended up losing their trail. When her father found out about this, it enraged him, and he made the boyfriend take him out to the areas where he followed the truck. They did end up finding a maroon-colored truck and called it in to the police. The tag registered to Gary Ridgway, but by the time the sergeant arrived at his home, he had remembered they both went to school together. He neglected to further investigate and just let it go. In 1984, he was arrested for trying to solicit sex from an undercover police officer posing as a prostitute. He was then given a lie detector test, and because he passed, he was let go, even though he landed on the suspect list. With the eyewitness accounts of Rebecca Garday and Marie Malvar's boyfriend, some of the investigators remained unconvinced that he was the Green River Killer, because they really had no hard evidence against him, not for a case like this. They had to be 100% certain, and at the time, they just weren't. In June of 1986, they got another break in the case when Gary became highly suspected this time, especially to one of the detectives, Matt Haney. A witness noticed a pickup truck. One thing the investigators held on to was the description of that maroon truck that the boyfriend of victim Marie Malvar was seen getting into. And this witness happened to see a truck matching the same description after she saw one of Gary's victims, Gail Matthews, who was last sitting in it and went missing in 1983. Another victim, Kimberly Nelson, was last seen on October of 1986 on Pacific Highway South by her friend who saw her get into a maroon truck. The last time she was seen alive again, and she was able to give the police their first composite sketch. With all these occurrences that were taking place, like the victim who got away and the eyewitnesses, plus the fact Gary had been arrested in the past for soliciting sex from a police officer, they had enough to secure a search warrant for Gary's home, property, and truck in 1987. The police began to use the photographs from their database of men who had been arrested to see if they could compare the composite to any of them in hopes of maybe finding a suspect. And when they did, they compared it to Gary Ridgway's mugshot from 1982. They ended up putting Ridgway on 24-hour surveillance and even watched as he traveled the Pacific highways, noticing that he was eyeballing the prostitutes up and down the strip. But they never caught him picking anyone up and nothing to link him to any of the murders. They also went to where Judith worked and questioned her, to which she stated she thought they were making a mistake because he was so good to her. Even Gary told Judith that it was all a big mix-up and she believed him, so they resumed life as she knew it, a healthy, normal relationship, while the truth was, that was just Gary's facade. His real life, his true life, was his thrill of taking human lives. After searching his home in April of 1987, it was not only shocking to the police that they couldn't find any evidence, but to all of his neighbors' surprise that he was even being looked at as possibly being the Green River Killer. If the police had called for an investigation back in 1983 when Malvar went missing, they would have busted him right there, because the body of Malvar was still inside his home. Also by this time, Judith had already been living there for several years. Gary had any evidence removed long before his home was searched in '87. She did wonder one thing though, why had he removed the carpet in his home? The police suspected this was because he had rolled some of his victims up in the carpet to take and dump in nearby but remote locations. By now, it was believed that between the bodies that were found and those still missing, put the Green River Killer's kill count up to 45 women. By 1990, the task force disbanded and they were no longer investigating Gary. But just because they couldn't arrest Gary or identify who the unsub was, didn't mean they had forgotten the case or the victims. It may have taken 11 years for DNA to improve testing results, but thankfully, Matt Haney, the detective that had that gut feeling back in 1987 that just because they couldn't prove it then, that Gary was their man. And before the investigation closed, he was very smart to have taken those saliva samples from him. In November of 2001, that move back in '87 became the smoking gun Matt Haney unknowingly took that day. After Gary had gotten away with murder for 2 decades, his sick game was over. They finally closed in on him when his DNA was linked and matched to 3 of his victims that were found in the Green River in 1982, Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, and Cynthia Hines. In addition, they were also able to tell by DNA testing along with other factors that he was the killer of Carol Christensen, the one and only victim in his later confessions that he claimed he felt regret. There is only one way to stop a serial killer, and that is to catch them. Thankfully, because of DNA, it is much harder to get away with murder these days. The King County Sheriff's Department arrested Gary on November 30th of 2001 as he was leaving his place of work, a job at a trucking company that he had worked at for 30 years. This is what King County Sheriff Dave Reichert had to say. At first, he denied he was the Green River Killer, but when authorities linked him to 3 more murders, 7 in total by 2003, and by now, he knew he was facing a death penalty case. Believe it or not, this man who took the lives of so many women and thoroughly enjoyed it, was scared to die. So he made a plea, and in return, if he promised to help give closure to many families and be able to not only admit to the killings, but prove he killed the 48 women, later to be 49, he was wanted for, plus another condition was to help them try to recover missing bodies, and in return, he would receive life in prison for each count of murder and be spared death. One of those bodies that had been missing since 1983 that Ridgway helped the authorities find was that of Marie Malvar, the victim whose boyfriend witnessed her get into his truck, and the angry father who helped the boyfriend track down where Gary was living, and sadly, a missed opportunity of catching him then. Had they pursued an investigation that day, something like 60 women's lives could have been saved. King County Sheriff's Department admits they are ashamed of this, but in my opinion, that responsibility lies solely on the policeman who visited Gary that day for doing nothing, and to Gary himself. Luckily, Detective Haney, who was very intuitive, just had a sinking feeling in his gut when he took those saliva samples back in 1987. He is the one that is credited, as he should be, with ultimately solving the Green River Killer case. In 2001, when Gary first was arrested, he denied any involvement in the murders, and Judith stood by her man's side. It was getting so much publicity, she had to hide inside her home and put up signs on her door that she basically wasn't talking to the press and to go away. When detectives came to her door the day Gary was arrested, she told them, "No, I do not believe that. He's always been so gentle and caring." She even said that she would testify for him in court and tell everyone that everything about him was good and that they were each other's best friends, including claiming he had never once been mean to her or abused her in any way. However, once the shock wore off and she began to see clearly enough that maybe she was just someone to hide behind, a fake life, fake wife, fake marriage in order to make his life seem normal so that he could continue to evade capture and do what he really wanted to do, which was kill, along with heavy evidence weighing against him, she began to believe he was guilty, and after 13 years of marriage, she divorced Gary. She had this to say in an interview.
After 6 years, she's out of hiding and ready to tell her story. What do you remember?
I was in shock that day when I heard someone driving up in the driveway, and I couldn't believe it. I still can't believe it, but it has happened.
And humiliating for Judith Ridgway, the serial killer's ex-wife.
He dropped in front of me and didn't know what to do. Everything stopped. I felt the anger that he had sex with someone else, that he hurt me. Oh, I'd say, why, you son of a bitch, why did you do this to me? He hurt, and I can't even imagine what they've been through.
And what about him, the man she believed was her Prince Charming? Judith refuses to visit Gary in prison. She won't take his calls, and she told him to stop writing letters. But her heart is still conflicted. Do you love him?
No. I love the man I knew, and I hate the man that took him away.
For the Eye at 5, I'm Liz Roca in Seattle.
And Judith now believes that there were two distinct, different Garys. Is she happy that he escaped the death penalty? Well, believe it or not, she says no. She believes he deserved to die for killing all those young women and
Gary is considered the most prolific in terms of how many women he has confessed to killing and the number they can tie him to. He not only killed more than Ted Bundy, but got away with it much longer too. Gary Ridgway was charged with 49 counts of murder and received life imprisonment for each victim. He is now 72 years old and serving his life sentences at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Washington. He claims that he has killed between 75 to 80 women, but that he can't remember all their names or faces. However, if any other jurisdictions outside of King County could ever link him to any unsolved killings, he could face more criminal charges, including the possibility of the death penalty.